Hello and welcome to Naturally Scott. I'm your host, Scott Harris, and thrilled to have you here. This is our 36th episode of Naturally Scott, so we're starting to rack up a few, and the guests just remain top-notch and interesting. Today is a gentleman named John Van Wyhe. John is a historian of science at the National University of Singapore. He is one of, if not the, world experts on Charles Darwin. And we spend an hour talking about Charles and dispelling a number of the things that I thought I knew. I kind of always associated Darwin with the theory of evolution, the Galapagos, and the Beagle. And all of those are true, but there is so much more to it. I especially like the way that John brings religion into it, the way it was brought into it during the time, and how different the views were in the early and mid-19th century compared to the early 20th century and now. It is a fascinating hour. I'm confident you'll learn things that you didn't know and come away with some questions and some challenges. So stay with us. The podcast is about to start. John Van Wyhe is my guest. Enjoy your day. Hello and welcome to this edition of Naturally Scott. I'm your host, Scott Harris, and today's show is a little bit different than normal. It's our first overseas guest. This is about show number 35, I think, and everybody else has been U.S.-based, but I discovered this gentleman, and I think it's going to make for a great hour. It's one that I've really looked forward to. It's one of these areas where I feel like I should know an awful lot more than I do, so I'm hoping to learn right along with you guys. The gentleman you're looking at is John Van Wyhe. He is the historian of science at the National University of Singapore. Do I have that right? Fantastic. Well, welcome. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. And I've never heard the title historian of science. I mean, I understand each of the three words, but what exactly does it mean?
Well, it's one of the many areas of history, right? There's military history, history of art, history of ideas, and history of science is a smaller one, so it's not as widely known as some of the others. But historians of science study the history of science, and particularly scientists, to be fair.
Okay. All right. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about Charles Darwin. You are also an expert in Alfred Russel Wallace, but since we only have an hour, and I think Darwin's life probably justifies maybe even a fraction more than an hour someday, we're going to leave Wallace for another show, if that's cool with you. So yeah. I think I speak for a lot of the audience. When I hear Darwin, I think of evolution, I think of the Galapagos, I think of the Beagle, and because I'm a birder, I think of the finches. But honest to goodness, outside of that, I am a babe in the woods here. So I'm kind of hoping you can walk us through just a little bit about Charles Darwin. And then I've got some specific questions for you. I want to talk about Darwin. I want to talk about evolution, science, and religion, and all those things kind of conflate into Darwin. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes.
So if you would, go ahead and just fire it up. Just tell us a bit about the man you've spent a lifetime studying.
Okay, well, Darwin is someone about whom everyone has heard something. Mm-hmm. He's been a famous name for 180 years or so. But I would say that most of what most people have heard about Charles Darwin is actually myths and legends. So it's hard to crack away all these layers that have accumulated about Darwin to get down to the real historical person and what actually happened. So Darwin was from an affluent family. He was well educated. He got a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to travel on a government surveying ship that was making super accurate maps of South America and then the Galapagos. And he was invited to come along as the naturalist on the voyage. They didn't use the word scientist in those days. And he was primarily a geologist at first, and he cracked rocks with his hammer and discovered things all up and down the South American coast and also into the interior. He had lots of discoveries. He found all kinds of extinct creatures that were previously unknown. And he found out that ways in which the whole continent and the Andes had probably been gradually formed. He came at a time at which science was getting pretty sophisticated. Nowadays, we tend to think of it as, oh, well, back then it must have been so primitive. But actually, no, they knew a lot already.
What years
And
was the trip?
the voyage was between 1831 and 1836. And a very important thing to clarify when we're talking about Darwin and the voyage of the Beagle and his theory of evolution is that what most people today think was the state of knowledge back then is completely wrong. Let me explain.
Please.
Most people have heard that, well, until Charles Darwin came along, everyone believed that the world was about 6,000 years old and that all the species in the world had been created at once and
The
so on.
traditional Christian view.
Yes, but that's not correct. That's not what people believed at that time. The scientific community had already figured out before Darwin that the world was really, really old. And the early geologists, all of them pious Christians, are the ones who discovered that there had never been a global flood, as described in the story in the Bible. And they discovered the fundamentals of the fossil record, which is that living things have come and gone millions of times over the course of the history of the Earth. And they were basically in a progressive order. That is, in the oldest, most ancient rocks, you had very primitive things, just seashells. And then you got things like very primitive fishes with no bones yet. And then you had bony fish. And then later you had reptiles. And then after that, there came mammals and so on. That's all known and understood and accepted by everyone before Darwin and before evolution was accepted. Now, to us today, you think, well, that sounds just like evolution to us.
Yes.
But they didn't accept evolution, but everyone accepted this fossil record was it was the hottest thing in science. Everyone knew about the discovery of all these new creatures.
When you say everyone, are you talking about lay people or are you talking about the scientific community?
Both.
So
yes.
Even devoutly religious people believe that the Earth was over 6,000 years old, and
every educated person knew that before Darwin comes along.
Okay.
So this was common knowledge. So those fights had happened a generation before Darwin about how old the Earth was and whether or not there had been a big flood and so on. And another thing that's important to remember is that the modern idea of science or religion, which group are you talking about, doesn't really work back then, because with maybe one or two exceptions, all the people in the scientific community were very religious Christians. So they weren't trying to go against the Bible. They were religious. The way to explain this, well, how could that be that they're discovering these things and accepting them that seem to go against the stories in the Bible, which they did? How can that be? It's because of the type of Christian they were back then, where the Bible had not received the role that it has for many people today. In other words, it had never been traditionally the kind of thing that you had to accept literally. That just has just never been part of Christian doctrine before. So when someone said, well, actually this global flood, there's no evidence for this in the Earth at all. This definitely didn't happen. And some people thought, oh, we don't like the sound of that, but it was not a deal breaker. Similarly, that living things hadn't been created at once wasn't a deal breaker. That's hard for people to get their heads around nowadays because it sounds so unfamiliar. But
yes,
that's the state of Christianity at the time. Even American preachers accepted these things I'm telling you about. It's not just the scientific community.
So we want to talk about Darwin, but when did that begin to change? When did belief in the stories as fact become dogmatic and deal breakers, to use your term?
That started with a particular denomination or a popular movement of evangelical Christianity in the UK and also in the US, where these groups, while science was becoming more popular and more talked about and dominant during that century, these groups decided to clear out from that and evolve this new way of adhering closely to a literal reading the Bible and so on. So that's actually a very late development. Okay. While at the same time describing themselves as being original.
Yeah, well, there you go. Did they view Did they view themselves as being challenged by science? Were they afraid that science was usurping organized religion?
That type of concern, of course, comes up all the time. It always has. What's different about the the time when Darwin was young is that religion was not really under threat. It was so all pervasive and so respected, and that there wasn't this feeling of being under threat. But I think by the end of the century, when so many of these things had toppled,
The end of the
including,
19th century.
yes, including once evolution was accepted and the evolution of human beings was accepted, then the context had changed and some types of religious people felt under threat.
So to be clear, when when in 1831, when Darwin left, there was a generally accepted belief that the Earth was very old, that there had not been a flood,
Yeah.
and that there was a variety of animals throughout the world, but there was not a belief yet in evolution.
Yes. So, for
So the
example, if you were to look at a coffee table book from the time, which would show you pictures of what we know today, they would have a list, a strip of pictures showing different eras in the Earth's past. You know, the really primitive ones at the bottom, and then sharks and things, and then reptiles and dinosaurs, and then early mammals that looked a little bit like things today, but are still quite weird. Right? Everyone was familiar with this picture of a changing life on Earth, but no one accepted that this was evolution. I mean, one or two radical people did.
so how did people think we
So how
got
did they do that? Yes.
Yes.
They thought that it must be the result of multiple creations, that each new layer in the rock, which had new species in it, and the ones below were gone, they'd obviously gone extinct, and so new ones had been created. That was generally the understanding, was that, well, obviously there have been lots of creations. And people said our new scientific understanding increases our reverence for God, because look how much more active he's been in the history of the earth. So much more
So that was not
creative.
an incompatible finding or thought process then.
Yeah. Yeah. So when Darwin starts out on the voyage of the Beagle, he's not interested in evolution, but he's very knowledgeable about geology and paleontology and the history of the earth. And he's trying to solve various puzzles of his own. And once he's done this for 5 years and he's seen more of the earth and more living things on it than almost anyone who had ever lived, he was astonishingly experienced by that time. Then he starts to think that all of these anomalies and puzzles can only be explained by life changes over time, by evolution.
Now, he would have been exposed to the idea of evolution before he left. He just wasn't a proponent of it.
It was very unpopular at the time.
But people knew about it.
Yes.
Okay.
Everyone knew about this terrible idea.
Okay.
It had
Okay.
been famously proposed by a French naturalist named Lamarck. A lot of people have still heard of Lamarck, but he had proposed his theory of evolution specifically to go against the new discovery of extinction at the beginning of the 19th century. Before that, extinction was considered to be an irreligious impossibility. No, God wouldn't allow anything to go extinct if he'd created it. But eventually this was proved that actually a lot of things have gone extinct. That was an uncomfortable realization. And so Lamarck, he thought, nope, God wouldn't allow this. And so he said, they didn't die out. They changed. They evolved. So his theory of evolution was to explain where all the extinct things went that we find in the fossil record. That the mastodons didn't go extinct. They evolved into modern elephants and so on. But the biggest name in French science at the time, Georges Cuvier, super powerful, mega genius, hated this. It was going against his work. And he used his power and his influence to completely discredit and crush Paul Lamarck, and thereby made any ideas of evolution sound equally absurd and unscientific and irreligious. It was just everything negative. So for decades, sure, everybody's heard of that idea, but that stupid idea, obviously, that can't be true. That's the way Darwin has been educated.
So when Darwin left on the Beagle, that was his That was part of his set of scientific beliefs.
Yeah, that was just not something he was looking for. But the fact that life had changed over time was common knowledge. And indeed, the things that he found as a geologist and a paleontologist, he saw thousands of examples of species change in local areas over geological time. When he would see that one layer, okay, something happened here and all of these shells went extinct. And then the layer above that, there are new species and so on. He had quite a sophisticated understanding about how extinction is often a very local event where something happens in a region to make things extinct. And only later does he then wonder, where do the new ones come from? These things are constantly going extinct. That's actually quite easy for everyone to accept by this time. If the environment changes or some cataclysm happens, like volcanic eruptions or something, the climate changes, things go extinct. And those fossils are the end. Those species never appear again. And then new ones appear. New ones are created. But Darwin found on the Voyage of the Beagle that the new things that appeared were of the same family of animals that had lived in the same place before. And this brought him to suggest what he called his law of succession. You know, like how kings and queens succeed one another.
Mm-hmm.
And that he saw that new species succeeded those that had come before them. And he published that. Now, that wasn't suggesting evolution, but it's really close.
It's very close.
But they thought, well, why is it, for example, that in caves in Australia, they had found the remains of extinct species of kangaroo in the place where kangaroos live today? Darwin found the remains of giant extinct sloth-like creatures, but the size of a small car, in the only place where sloths live. Those are examples that he would use to put forward this law of succession, that similar things follow in the same place. But that's still consistent with a form of creationism, that for some reason, sloth things get created here and kangaroo things get created there.
When you say that things are created, this is a supreme being. This is a god that comes down every once in a while and says, let's get rid of the mastodons and replace them with elephants?
That's a very good question, because they didn't agree on that at this time. They would use the word creation, and for us modern people reading it, we just think it means one thing. But really, they could mean a lot of things by it. In fact, you can find an explicit discussion where a geologist says, when a geologist uses the word creation, he means formed by means we do not know.
Okay.
So they accepted that the extinctions happen through natural events. And
over a long period of time.
Yeah, sometimes. Other times they thought it might be a rapid event.
Well, I mean, it had been happening for a long period of time. There were
everyone accepted
millennia after millennia of examples. Okay.
Yeah. And then, so when new species appeared, when they said that they were created, they could mean either that they were supernaturally created by God somehow, or that they were formed by some natural means that they didn't know. Whichever it was, everyone was happy to think that God is behind all of it anyway. So it wasn't so much, is it God or nature, as we might think. For them, if nature is doing it, well, that's still God. I mean, the way Newton had discovered how the heavens work with things orbiting around because of gravity, they said that is something that God made. He made the laws of nature, and they're so beautiful and they're so wonderful. Whereas in the past, people thought that some angels had to be up there flapping their wings, pushing the planets around. But no. God had a much more profound way of doing it, these laws of nature. So when Darwin comes out with his theory of evolution, for a lot of Christians, it's, oh, right, that's another way that God makes nature work.
So where on the trip, on the 5-year trip, or do you know, where did Darwin start to think now that maybe evolution, and not a stair-stepping of creation, but a gradual fluid evolution? Where did he start? Because that has to be a difficult thing to come to. I mean, if you're a scientist and you're well educated and you're brilliant, and he was all of those things, and now you're taking what's probably a core belief and you're looking around at caves in Australia and Central America, and we'll get to the Galapagos, and suddenly you think, my goodness, no, I don't any longer believe that happened. That had to be a big moment. I mean, was it an epiphany or was it over time or?
It's definitely over time. A
Okay.
lot of anomalies piled up that didn't make sense unless living things change over time. Now, we all think that nowadays in the modern world that it was the Galapagos that did it. Well, sort of.
Yeah,
Darwin went
talk
to
to me
the
about
Galapagos.
that, because I think a lot of people think he sailed to the Galapagos, confirmed a pre-held belief in the theory of evolution, and then zipped back to the UK. But that wasn't the case at all. So why is he so closely associated with the Galapagos? And I'm all ears, by the way, because my wife and I have booked a trip there. We've never
Great.
been. I'm pretty excited about that. But so why is he so closely associated? I mean, is it the finches? What is it that
Yes. Well,
ties
you've
layman's
come to the
mind
right
like
place
mine?
for that question, because I wrote an article answering exactly this. Why do we all think that Darwin had this great discovery on the Galapagos? Historians have known for many years that he didn't. The evidence is absolutely clear. He didn't have an epiphany. He didn't think of evolution on the Galapagos. And yet, by the 20th century, everyone thinks he did. Here's the explanation. After Darwin's death, as people began to retell
Which
his
was
story
when?
over,
Which was when? When did he die?
Darwin died in 1882.
Okay.
So
Okay.
his story was retold endlessly because he was so famous. And in the early years, you can find any biographical dictionary, you will, or the obituaries of Darwin. The Galapagos are often not even mentioned when telling Darwin's story. We find that unbelievable.
Yes.
They weren't a big part of the story. It seems to be around the 1930s when they celebrated the 100th anniversary of his visit to this famous place, a place that he had made famous and interesting from his book, The Voyage of the Beagle. And that's when the two became connected, that he thought of his theory of evolution there, when in fact he didn't. But it was one of the most important parts of his evidence when he did come up with this theory. I don't mean to downplay that, but the historical reality is that Darwin examined the Galapagos and collected all kinds of plants and animals, but he was still a creationist. We know this because on the later stop in Australia, he wrote in his diary about seeing the little pits in the sand made by antlions. And he says, what would a skeptic say to this? Surely the hand of the same creator has been at work here as at home. That's after the Galapagos.
Okay.
But sometime after that, when the ship is almost home, Darwin is going through all his collections, getting them ready to hand over to experts. And in the bird notes on the Galapagos, which he's preparing for an expert, he's reflecting on those he's found. And for the mockingbirds, he has noticed that he found different kinds on 3 different islands. He's not sure, without access to a reference collection, are these 3 varieties or are they 3 different species? And he says, this makes the study of archipelagos very important, because if they turn out to be 3 different species, this would undermine the belief that species don't evolve. That's the first time he ever mentions the topic.
And that was on the trip home. So in 35 or 36?
36, yeah. Then when he gets back and experts start to examine his collections, the mockingbirds and then the finches become
Tell us
important.
about the finches.
Because at the time, Darwin collected a lot of drab little birds, which he thought were lots of different types of birds, wrens, grosbeaks, finches, and so on. When an expert ornithologist examined them, he told Darwin, these are all finches, and I'm classing them as members of one family because they're closely related and they are unique to the Galapagos and exist nowhere else. Aha! Then they take on the evolutionary implication for Darwin. because he knows as a geologist, the Galapagos erupted out of the sea as molten rock, as volcanoes. There was no life on them. You come back in a few million years, there's life on them. Where did it come from? Conventional wisdom would be it was somehow created there. But Darwin knows, as an expert on the animals of South America, that they look astonishingly like things from South America, just a little bit different. So he knows that the most plausible explanation is that stray migrants get blown to the Galapagos from time to time, and then they're isolated on all these different islands, isolated from South America and from each other. These little land birds don't fly to other islands if they can help it. Maybe they get blown in a storm once in a while. So with that isolation for a long time, clearly they had diverged and evolved into different species.
Well, that must have been shocking because while he had 5 years to kind of adjust that and have it go through his mind, when he left, the world believed one thing, and when he came back, he delivered a message that it was different, right? I mean, was it dramatic? Did it sweep the continent, or was it an idea that was just kind of ignored? And did Lamarck come after him, or what happened?
Oh, Lamarck was a generation before. He was dead before all of this happened.
Okay.
And his name had been so sullied and blackened by Cuvier and lots of other people who were bashing him that Darwin had a bit of a problem insisting that his theory wasn't the same. In fact, this is a common problem that we have one word, we have the word evolution, but actually there are many evolution theories that are very different from each other, but we have the same word for them. So this can be confusing.
Share what some of them are, because I think I'm reasonably well educated. I did not know that there were a variety of theories that would fall under that. I imagine many of our audience doesn't either. So share what those are.
Okay, so while Darwin was working on his own theory and hadn't published it yet, a popular science book was published called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. And this book was all about evolution. He used a different word, but it was about the evolution, not just of life, but of everything. He had the cosmos evolving, solar systems evolving, the geology of the earth evolving, and then life on earth evolving. And for him, evolution was up the ladder progress. So there was a deep law of nature for this author that nature is like an escalator. It just inevitably goes up and progresses. And so species just inevitably progress upwards. And every once in a while, say a squirrel, for example, gives birth to a different species of squirrel, a higher species, as it were. So his version of evolution would be one of jumps. Jump, 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 jump. Dramatically. One species just gives rise to another. And there's just this inherent law of nature that's going to make things go up. That was his particular one. That was hugely controversial. Darwin was watching this, of course, this anonymous popular science book. We now know it was written by a prominent publisher and amateur geologist named Robert Chambers. But he kept his identity, his authorship secret, so it wouldn't hurt his business. Because evolutionary ideas at that time were taboo. They were not only considered irreligious, but they were considered bad science. That was junk science. Nobody wanted to touch it. What was embarrassing for the scientific community about his book was that he tried to say that, look, all of these discoveries of the last few decades, they all show evolution, right? We talked a minute ago about all the layers in the rocks progressively getting more complex, and everyone knows this. Well, the geological community have been trying hard to emphasize that this has nothing to do with evolution. What we're finding is, well, just shows God's had lots of creations. So this popular science writer says, nah, it shows evolution. So that was an embarrassment. And a lot of scorn was poured on this book. Nowadays, we wouldn't find it particularly objectionable, but at the time, it was hugely controversial.
Are there proponents of that view of evolution now?
No.
No? Okay.
No. And Lamarck's theory is unfortunately misdescribed in basically every publication you will ever find. Every textbook on Earth, I think, defines Lamarck's theory of evolution as the inheritance of acquired characteristics. It is just a universal belief that, like the giraffe stretches its neck really hard to reach the leaves at the top of the tree and thereby stretches its neck a little bit and then passes that on to its offspring. And that's how things evolve. No, this is not Lamarck's theory. Lamarck's theory is actually similar to that popular science one I just told you about. It's also about a law of inherent progress in nature that would make things progress up the scale. But he does also have that inheritance of acquired characteristics as a subcomponent of his theory. So in Darwin's day, when people referred to Lamarck's theory of evolution, they'd say, oh, that just comes from from the willing of animals. The giraffe wants to reach the leaves. They change themselves, which is also a caricature. It's only after the year 1900, when modern genetics begins, that people call Lamarck's theory of evolution the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And now everyone believes that. But it doesn't come from Lamarck. It's not what his theory of evolution is all about. And that was a belief shared by very many naturalists in those days, including Charles Darwin. Almost everyone thought that things could be passed on that happened to a living thing, an injury, for example, that things could be passed on. This is just a widespread belief. But today it's always called Lamarckism, very unfairly and inaccurately.
Well, that's unfortunate. So now you have Darwin's theory, which was not fully developed or fully evolved, let's say, when he landed back in the UK, right?
I would say when he arrived back, he probably has just the slightest suspicions. But over the next few years, that's when he develops it. He starts jotting in some of his old notebooks, and then he buys a whole set of new notebooks to address these new questions. How does life work? Really basic, fundamental questions like, why do things die? Why are the generations of living things so short? All kinds of questions. Why is there sexual reproduction in nature at all? Why don't things just bud off from one another like an amoeba? Or why aren't there just hermaphrodites, as in some parts of the animal world? And then how do things become adapted to their way of life in the living world here? How does the woodpecker's beak come to be shaped in exactly the way it is and function so perfectly to do what it does? How do its tail feathers come to be so stiff to act as a prop while it's standing on a tree? All of these things about living things. Darwin's not an abstract armchair theorist. I mean, he is someone who has observed and handled living things his entire life. And he's looking to understand, how did they get to be this way? So he develops his theory of evolution over a couple of years. He has a lot of twists and turns. It's a lot of dead end theories with things he drops. He goes through a phase of thinking that things jump from species to species, boom, 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 that some species must just
even
give
post
birth
the
to another.
Beagle trip.
This is all post Beagle, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So Darwin becomes an evolutionist in London after the voyage, as he himself records in some of his notebooks when he starts thinking about the history of his ideas. But Darwin is got this huge research program in mind, but let's not forget that that's not his day job. He has just come back from this 5-year voyage, and he has a mountain of specimens and discoveries to work through, to publish, and so on. It will take him more than 10 years to do that, of course. But in the midst of that, he starts coming up with his theory of evolution, which, from the few references to it he makes, he says, when I finish everything else, then I'll move full time to my theory of evolution, which is why for many years people thought that he held it back, that he kept it a secret, that he delayed it, because it was such a taboo idea at the time. But we now know that he talked about his belief with his family, his friends, his neighbors, his colleagues. It was not a secret that he was interested in these unorthodox ideas. People knew. In fact, that anonymous book I told you about, Vestiges, there were a lot of guesses about who could have written this. He was one of the people that people guessed might be the author. And that's more than 10 years before he published his theory of evolution. How is that? Because people knew Charles Darwin was one of those few people interested in those silly ideas of evolution.
So you had these ideas that some sort of crater came down and replaced extinct animals with new animals. And then you had a jump theory of evolution where one day a squirrel gives birth to a super squirrel. And you said that Darwin did believe that for a while, and that was post Beagle. So
He was speculating about Beagle things, but post
okay.
Beagle.
So now when did he start to come to this idea that it's these tiny, tiny little changes over long periods of time, kind of the way that we, I think, generally accept evolution today? So
Yeah.
where did he's got to break away from two previous theories that he's held, right? Because he left believing in the creator coming back. And then at some point you said he was a believer in the I don't know what to call it, the jump theory of evolution. And now he's coming to a third theory, which is the one that most of us are familiar with. Where does he start to make that leap? What is it in his work and his studies that opens that door?
Actually, a very complicated story that we probably don't want to go into it. He actually goes through 5 theories of trial and error.
Okay.
Trial and error. He works on various things and eventually he drops them. But by 1838, 1839, he's got ideas that we would recognize now as incredibly slow and gradual. He reads the famous book by the early economist Thomas Malthus on population theory. And that's where he gets the idea for natural selection from. And most writers like to say, aha, you see, Darwin's theory of evolution was inspired by economic theory. A lot of people love this. But I think, nah. Have you read the book? It's full of examples of animal populations. It's about population explosions. It's about the potential of geometrical population growth and how the inevitability of this has severe implications for humanity's future. Darwin's not interested in the politics. He's reading everything he can about living things. And this book is full of examples of population phenomena. That's what interests him. And that is the part that inspires natural selection. If there's so much reproduction, so much growth in numbers, but the potential that should result from geometrical population growth almost never happens. And if it does, we call it a plague. That means most things must be dying in order to keep numbers about stable as they are. Therefore, most things are dying. What is it about the few that don't? That gives him the idea about natural selection, that so many things from eggs, seeds, pollen, all kinds of things are being born by the billions, and most of them don't survive. That focuses attention on the fact that a tiny minority makes it rather than most things just don't. And natural selection, that's his idea. The other part that's important is his realization of something that others just don't take notice of, which is that all living things are unique. They're different. We look at a flock of birds or sheep and they all look the same. And to some people classifying them, perhaps you like to think that they're all the same because it's easier to put them in the box they belong to. But for Darwin, it was important to emphasize, no, each one of them is unique and each part of its body is actually unique. You could dissect any 2 animals of the same species when you look closely enough at any little organs and little tiny parts of their bodies. Every little part of everything varies. And because they're constantly being born, all a little bit different, some of those differences will survive better than others. That's the birth of the theory of evolution that we now have.
So this idea of natural selection and our current theory of evolution, when did Darwin go public with that?
Right. So,
and
as I said, he was
received?
Yeah. So he's got other things to do first. And for 20 years, he works on his theory of evolution in the background while he finishes off the main projects that were already on his work list. When he gets all of those done, the last one he does is his taxonomy of all the barnacles in the world. When he finishes that, the very same day he writes in his notebook, got out my notes for species theory. And so then it's full time from the mid 1850s. And eventually he starts writing a book for publication, which would have been several volumes. He wanted to overwhelm his skeptical colleagues with all the evidence and all the good arguments that he had, that evolution wasn't a ridiculous, unscientific idea, but it's real. And he's 3/4 of the way through this giant book when he gets a surprise letter from his correspondent, Alfred Russel Wallace in Southeast Asia. And Wallace has written an essay, which he has not dared to publish himself because it suggests evolution too.
Now,
And
did Wallace do this? Were they colleagues? Did he do it independently?
completely independently.
Okay.
Now, that book we mentioned before, Vestiges, that popular science book, Wallace was one of the many people who liked it. He liked the evolution picture in that book. I mean, we don't have enough from him to know how exactly he accepted every part of it, but generally he was one of the few people who thought evolution was probably true. So when he went on his collecting expedition in Southeast Asia to collect animals, birds and insects mostly, to ship back to sell to museums, he already believes in some kind of evolution, but privately. He's unemployed and he's not too keen to spout this very unpopular view. But he does write a couple of papers which skate super close to suggesting it, but without ever actually doing so. In fact, his most famous one, where he gets quite close to suggesting evolution, I think over 20 times, he says species are created, which he doesn't really think. He's using
But he
that
does want to
language.
get a job at some point.
He's using that as camouflage, but he wants to see if he can push the scientific community with the idea of succession like Darwin had. That, look, all the evidence. It's really orderly, isn't it? Anyway, he and Darwin have been corresponding for a couple of years. And in their first letter, which although it's lost, we actually know what it said. Because Darwin wrote to a whole list of collectors around the world, or people around the world, Westerners, asking them for local domestic poultry and animal bird skins for his research on the origin of species. And Wallace is one of the people on this long list. Now, we don't have the one that went to Wallace, but we have 3 others, and they're all the same. He tells the person, sorry to bother you, I'm working on the origin of species and varieties. Could you please send me the local domestic animals, the skins? So that letter was not kept by Wallace, but I think the following year, he sends back some domestic duck skins, I think it was, to his agent and says, these are for Mr. Darwin. So that's how we know Darwin mentioned evolution to him first. Almost every book gets that the other way around, based only on the surviving letters. But that's not the complete story. Anyhow, so Wallace knows that of all the big names in science that he's able to write to, Charles Darwin is the only one who's interested in evolution. So when he has this brilliant idea about how things can become adapted and evolved, he writes an essay, doesn't send it for publication. He sends it to Darwin, someone who's safe, who's on his side, who can either say, great, or not very good, whatever.
So
Darwin,
one man peer review.
Yeah. I mean, he's sending it to someone who will not embarrass him, someone he can trust. Well, Darwin is shocked because he thinks that the theory is identical to his own. Historians now know that, well, they're not identical. Nothing's ever identical. But anyhow, Darwin thinks it is. And he sends it off to his mentor, the geologist, Charles Lyell, who is Wallace's hero. And Wallace has his book of geology next to him on the table on the island of Ternate in Southeast Asia when he wrote this evolution essay. The essay is absolutely aimed at him, at Charles Lyell, the famous geologist and paleontologist, and the one who has spent his career attacking Lamarck's theory of evolution. And so Wallace is trying to use his own, Lyell's own respected scientific reasoning and principles to prove him wrong. That Lyell thinks evolution is impossible, it can't happen. He thinks that there's some kind of limit beyond which species can't change. We all know that if you send a breed of sheep or horses to some other part of the world, after 100 years, they'll look a little bit different. They change a bit, they adapt a bit, but there's limits that beyond that, they couldn't go because that would be evolution. So Wallace crafts this brilliant theory using Lyell's reasoning to show that, oh, yes, they can keep on changing. So it's absolutely aimed at Lyell, but Wallace doesn't know him. He couldn't write to him. So he sends it to Mr. Darwin. Darwin says, yikes, this is the same as my theory. He does send it to Lyell the same day. And Lyell's just really not very interested, doesn't respond very well. And to cut a long story short, Darwin keeps asking for advice. Should I just send Mr. Wallace's paper to be published right away? I think that's the honorable thing for me to do. Again, Lyell says, just publish your own stuff now. You've been working on this for 20 years. Go ahead. And Darwin says,
even though Lyell didn't agree with it.
No, he doesn't agree with evolution, but he's one of Darwin's best friends. He knows that Darwin's working on this. In fact, he had warned him a couple of years before when Darwin finally explained the details of the natural selection part of his theory. Lyell had said, you should publish something soon in case someone else thinks of that idea. Because once you hear it, it sounds so simple.
Yes.
But thinking your way there in the first place is not simple. Anyway, so Lyell had warned him, you ought to do something more quickly. And Darwin was not the type to just get his name in print for any kind of credit. He wanted to deliver the death blow with his big book and all the evidence at once. So Lyell and Darwin's other good friend, the botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker, when he was shared into this correspondence, he decided, okay, what we'll do is we'll read Wallace's paper and something earlier from Darwin at the same scientific meeting, credit shared, no awkward priority disputes, and that's how we'll deal with this. And that's what they did. And the rest is history. So the theory of evolution by natural selection was first read in their various papers to a meeting of the Linnaean Society of London in 1858.
Were either or both men there?
Wallace was still in Southeast Asia. He was in New Guinea getting birds of paradise. And Darwin, one of his children had just died. He was not in attendance, which is not really that unusual that someone is not present when their papers are read. That happens every day. Nowadays, of course, we think of this as a great historic moment. But as usual, that's all hindsight. That's retrospect. It wasn't that big a deal. And in fact, historically now, I can say that we don't have evidence that a single person was convinced about evolution from their joint papers. They were later published in the Society's journal. No one was converted to evolution by both of their papers combined. Because, as you say, it takes a lot to change your mind on something so fundamental.
Yes, when you know something to be true, and now it's being challenged a little bit, that's the first reaction is to defend the position you've held your entire professional life.
Yeah.
So
Darwin is then prodded by people. Oh, come on. We don't want to wait for your full book to be published. Can you give us an overview now? So he spends a year condensing his big book that was 3/4 finished and all those 20 years of research and experiments into one book. And that's The Origin of Species. And I think the reason it's so powerful and so convincing is that he had gone over the argument and the topics so many times and condensed down until it became very effective in this one volume. So when that book appeared, yes, it was hugely controversial because now one of the big names in the scientific community was arguing for this unorthodox, this radical, objectionable idea of evolution. But he had a lot of allies and he had an overwhelming amount of evidence that was hard to argue with, but they did. There was
Of
a
course
huge
they did.
number of reviews. There were endless talks and lectures and books written against it. Sorry, my clock is chiming.
A pleasant sound, by the way. So I really hate to do this, but our producers asked us to keep this to an hour and we're getting close. And I don't want to let this show. First of all, if you'll agree to, I absolutely want to have you back on after the first of the year, because clearly there's a lot more to discuss. I mean, all we've gotten to is the launch of the idea. I imagine there was an argument or two and maybe a couple of weeks spent before that became universally accepted. So I'd love to discuss that. But I do want to highlight, you have published 4 books, I believe. Darwin's shorter publication, Darwin's Notebook from the Voyage of the Beagle, Darwin in Cambridge, and a biography that is at least reviewed to be accessible to non-scientists.
Yes.
Is that fair? Okay.
I've published 19 books in total.
Are there any that you want to highlight other than, I know you've got a new one coming out about Darwin's Geological Diary from the Voyage. Are there any of the other 19 that you want to highlight before you discuss the new one that you have coming out? Or do you want to wait for the next show?
I'll just say I would recommend my book, Dispelling the Darkness, which is the true story of the Wallace Darwin story.
Dispelling the Darkness.
Dispelling the Darkness.
Okay,
yes.
We will put that up on the screen for those watching this on YouTube, and hopefully some people that haven't read it yet will. But before we go, tell us about the new book you have coming out.
Right. Well, this one is the last of the big things Darwin wrote during the Voyage of the Beagle. He wrote a personal diary, lots of letters and notebooks, and a stack of papers on biology. All of these have been published over the years and edited, and they're very interesting. But the biggest stack of them all was his geology notes. That is the last account of the Voyage of the Beagle by Darwin himself to be published. And yes, a lot of it is very tedious geological detail. Amongst it is, it's an independent account of his voyage in his own words. This will never happen again, that we'll have another account of this famous voyage by Darwin. So there's a lot of surprises.
When did that book come out?
It's with the Oxford University Press now. We're hoping it will come out in 2026.
Okay, well, good luck with that. I just found out my next book is not going to be published until May of 27. So publishers are a patient lot, more patient than their authors, by the way. But is the name of that book, do I have it correct? Is the working title Darwin's Geological Diary from the Voyage?
It's Darwin's Geological Diary and Field Notes from the Voyage of the Beagle.
Field Notes.
Yeah, so it'll be quite a hefty volume.
I imagine it will be. I will look forward to that coming out. I'm throwing my email up here as I do on every podcast. If you've got questions for me, please send them in. If you've got any for John, send them in. I'll get them over to him. And in the meantime, John, if you would, a book that you would recommend that the audience, if they were interested in this podcast, what would be something other than one of your books that you would recommend they read?
Well, it's hard to narrow things down to only one book, but perhaps I would recommend Darwin's book on earthworms. It was his last book, published the year before his death, and it's very Darwin, in which he looked at something very humble and overlooked by everyone else that seems so insignificant, just like the little differences that natural selection chooses, that the cumulative actions of earthworms turn out to shape much of the surface of the earth, and they make agriculture and a lot of environments possible. And he studied them in great detail, finding out if they had any intelligence. Can they hear? How do they react to tobacco smoke or to the sound of a whistle being blown next to them, and so on? The experiments are charming, but the book became an instant bestseller because before that, people thought worms were a pest. They thought they were the gardener's enemy. And Darwin showed that they're the gardener's friend. And so it still makes for a good read today.
And the name of the book?
It's called The Formation of Vegetable Mold by the Action of Worms.
Okay. All right. Well, we will find a copy of that and throw it up on the screen. John, I got to tell you, this has been fascinating. You have answered a lot of questions that I didn't know that I had, and you have generated a lot more questions. So I am going to impose on you to come back because I want to hear so much more. I'm going to call this pre-release, and then we'll do another one on the impact it had on the world and on Darwin himself. Once he got that theory out there, I think it's spectacular.
Do you mind if I mention that the Earthworm
No.
book and all of Darwin's other publications are on the project that I direct called The Complete Work of Charles Darwin Online?
Yes, you know what? I'm sorry, I skipped over that card. I will get the website and put it up on the screen so that people can find it. But what is the URL for people that are listening only?
It's darwin-online.org.uk.
Okay. All right. Hopefully we'll get some people to go to that.
You
I
just need to
sincerely.
Google Charles Darwin. It should be one of the on the front page.
Okay, perfect. John, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot, and I now realize how much more I have to learn. You shook a couple of things that I knew to be factually true that perhaps were not. And so I'll be putting some thought to that. And as I wrap up every show, I encourage people to get outdoors. Maybe not 5 years on a sailing vessel, but at least for an afternoon at the local park. And when you do, and you're out there, stay safe and stay curious. John, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.